Frank Beard, what really happened to ZZ Top's legendary drummer? There are some musicians who become famous because they are impossible to ignore. And then there are musicians who become legendary because they make everyone around them sound better. Frank Beard was the second kind. For more than 5 decades, he sat behind the drum kit of ZZ Top, quietly providing the rhythm behind one of the most recognizable sounds in American rock music. But today, the story has changed. Frank Beard has died at the age of 77. He passed away on August 17, 2026, at his ranch in Richmond, Texas, while receiving hospice care and surrounded by family. The cause of death has not been publicly revealed. And that is why the question so many fans are now asking is simple. What really happened to Frank Beard? The answer is not just about the final days of his life. It is about a young Texas drummer who helped create one of rock's most unforgettable bands, survived addiction, endured health problems, watched his closest musical partners change, and somehow remained behind the drums for more than half a century. And there is one detail about Frank Beard that has always made his story almost impossible to forget. His last name was Beard. But he was the one member of ZZ Top who famously did not have the giant beard. Billy Gibbons had one. Dusty Hill had one. Frank Beard. He usually had a mustache. That strange little joke became part of the mythology of ZZ Top. But behind the sunglasses, the humor, the famous music videos, and the larger-than-life image was a serious musician. Frank Beard was born in Texas in 1949 and began playing drums when he was still young. He wasn't simply interested in becoming a celebrity. He was interested in rhythm. Before ZZ Top became an international rock institution, Beard was already moving through the Texas music scene. He played with different groups and eventually became closely connected with Dusty Hill. That partnership would become extremely important. Beard and Hill even worked together as a rhythm section for blues legend Lightnin' Hopkins. For a young musician, that kind of experience was priceless. Playing behind a blues musician wasn't about showing off. It was about listening. It was about knowing when to hit hard, when to pull back, and when to leave space. Those lessons would eventually become part of the ZZ Top sound. By the end of the 1960s, Billy Gibbons, Dusty Hill and Frank Beard had come together around the group that would become ZZ Top. And almost immediately, something special happened. They sounded like Texas. Their music blended blues, rock, boogie and a kind of swagger that was difficult to copy. Frank's drums were a major part of that identity. He wasn't trying to dominate every song. He created the foundation. That foundation allowed Billy Gibbons' guitar to sound bigger. It allowed Dusty Hill's bass to lock into the groove. And it gave ZZ Top the rhythm that fans could recognize within seconds. Their early records established them as a powerful Texas band. But nobody could have predicted what would happen next. ZZ Top would eventually become much more than a successful blues rock group. They would become an American cultural phenomenon. And Frank Beard would be sitting behind the drums through almost all of it. But the road to that success was not easy. In the late 1970s, the non-stop lifestyle of rock and roll began catching up with the band. ZZ Top took a break from touring. Billy Gibbons and Dusty Hill went their separate ways for a while. And Frank Beard was dealing with something much more serious. Addiction. Beard later spoke openly about his struggles with drugs and the damage they caused in his life. He entered rehabilitation and worked to get sober. For the band, this was a difficult period. But instead of simply replacing him, Billy and Dusty waited. They believed Frank was the drummer they needed. That decision would matter enormously. Because when ZZ Top returned, they were not the same band that had left. They were about to enter the biggest chapter of their career. And Frank Beard was ready to play. The comeback would lead directly into the era that made ZZ Top famous around the world. And that is where the story becomes even more surprising. Because the quiet drummer behind the band was about to become part of one of the biggest rock images of the 1980s. And almost nobody could have predicted how massive it would become. Frank Beard, the rise of ZZ Top. When ZZ Top returned from its late 1970s break, the music industry was changing. And the band was changing with it. The Texas blues sound was still there. The guitars were still loud. The rhythm was still heavy. But ZZ Top was about to discover something that would completely transform its career. MTV. In the early 1980s, music videos became almost as important as the songs themselves. And ZZ Top understood the power of an image. Billy Gibbons and Dusty Hill had their enormous beards. They wore sunglasses. They dressed in a way that looked almost like a cartoon version of Texas rock stars. And Frank Beard stood behind them, ironically looking like the least bearded man in the group. But the joke only made the image stronger. Then came the music. Gimme all your lovin', dot. Sharp-dressed man. Legs. The videos were strange, funny, stylish and completely different from what many other rock bands were doing. There were hot rods. There were beautiful women. There were exaggerated characters. And there were three musicians who looked as though they had walked out of another universe. But underneath all of that visual spectacle was an incredibly tight band. And Frank Beard was at the center of it. His drumming gave ZZ Top's music its movement. The guitar could be dirty and bluesy. The bass could be heavy. But the drums kept everything moving forward. That was Frank's specialty. He understood groove. He understood restraint. And he knew how to make a simple beat sound powerful. The band's 1983 album, Eliminator, became one of the defining records of the era. Suddenly, ZZ Top was no longer just a respected Texas rock band. They were international stars. Their songs were everywhere. Their videos were everywhere. And their image became instantly recognizable. But fame didn't change the basic chemistry between the three musicians. Billy Gibbons remained the guitarist and frontman. Dusty Hill remained the powerful bass player and singer. And Frank Beard remained the heartbeat behind them. The funny thing is that many casual fans didn't immediately understand just how important the drummer was. People saw the beards. They remembered the cars. They remembered the videos. They remembered Billy's guitar. But listen closely to the songs. Frank is everywhere. On tracks like La Grange, the rhythm is essential to the entire identity of the song. On Tush, the groove gives the guitar its swagger. And during the MTV era, the drums helped keep the band's polished production from losing its raw Texas energy. That balance became one of ZZ Top's greatest strengths. They could sound modern without abandoning their roots. And Frank Beard was one of the reasons they could do it. As the years passed, ZZ Top became one of the longest-running major rock bands with its classic lineup intact. There were changes around them. Music trends changed. Record sales changed. MTV changed. Rock music changed. But ZZ Top kept going. And Frank kept playing. There were difficult moments. There were health problems. There were personal challenges. But he continued returning to the drum stool. In 2002, Beard even had to deal with an emergency appendectomy while the band was touring. It was another reminder that behind the mythology were three real human beings. By 2004, the band's legacy had become undeniable. ZZ Top was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Frank Beard stood alongside Billy Gibbons and Dusty Hill as one of the musicians who had helped build the band's identity. And yet, even after all those years, Frank still wasn't the stereotypical rock star personality. He was often the quieter member. He didn't need to stand in the spotlight. His instrument did the talking. That may be one reason his story is so fascinating. He spent decades being famous without constantly chasing fame. He helped create one of the biggest rock bands in America without becoming the band's loudest personality. And he survived an era when many musicians didn't. But there was another chapter waiting for him. One that would change ZZ Top forever. In 2021, Dusty Hill died. For fans, it was almost impossible to imagine ZZ Top without him. Billy Gibbons and Frank Beard had lost the man who had stood beside them for decades. But Dusty had made his wishes known. He did not want ZZ Top to simply disappear. So the band continued. Elwood Francis joined on bass. And Frank Beard kept playing. The original trio was gone. But the spirit of the band remained. Then came another warning sign. In 2025, Frank stepped away from touring because of a health issue. The exact medical problem was not publicly revealed at the time. John Douglas temporarily filled in. Later, Beard returned to the stage. For fans, it seemed like another difficult chapter that had been overcome. But in 2026, the situation became more serious. Frank's health again forced him away from the road. Michael Monaghan stepped in as drummer. And then came the news that no ZZ Top fan wanted to hear. Frank Beard had died. The man who had spent more than 50 years keeping the beat for ZZ Top was gone. But the full story of his final chapter tells us something important. Frank Beard did not simply disappear. He kept trying to return. He kept his connection to the band. And until his health made it impossible, he remained part of the musical family he had helped create. Now the question is no longer whether Frank Beard will return to the stage. It is what his legacy will mean. And that legacy is much bigger than one band. It is the story of a drummer who helped turn Texas blues into an international sound. It is the story of a musician who survived his darkest years. And it is the story of a man whose last name became one of rock's greatest jokes. The man named Beard who never needed a beard to become unforgettable. Frank Beard, the man behind the myth. For a musician who spent more than 50 years in one of the world's most recognizable bands, Frank Beard's private life remained surprisingly private. That was part of his personality. He didn't seem desperate to explain himself. He didn't need to be the center of attention. But there was one part of his life that he eventually became willing to discuss. His addiction. During the 1970s, ZZ Top was living the kind of lifestyle that could destroy people. They were constantly traveling. They were performing hundreds of shows. Money was coming in. Drugs were everywhere. And Beard eventually found himself trapped in addiction. He later described that period honestly, without pretending it had been glamorous. He entered rehabilitation and worked toward sobriety. For ZZ Top, the decision was simple. They needed Frank. Billy Gibbons later recalled the idea that there was no other drummer. That loyalty mattered. Because many bands would have replaced a musician and moved forward. ZZ Top didn't. They waited. And Frank eventually returned. That recovery became one of the most important turning points in his life. The band also became a different kind of success story. Instead of destroying themselves with fame, the three members developed a remarkable longevity. They kept recording. They kept touring. They kept making jokes. And they kept protecting the chemistry that made ZZ Top unique. Frank's role in that chemistry was bigger than many people realized. A drummer is often judged by how much attention he attracts. Frank was almost the opposite. His strength was making the song feel natural. He could push the beat without making it sound rushed. He could leave space without making the music feel empty. And he could support Billy and Dusty without disappearing completely. That is a difficult balance. It takes experience. It takes discipline. And it takes an understanding of the band's musical identity. Frank had all three. Over the decades, ZZ Top became one of the most recognizable American rock acts in history. They sold millions of records. They became MTV stars. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They became part of movies, television, commercials, and popular culture. And through all of it, Frank Beard remained behind the kit. Even his appearance became part of the joke. Imagine being in ZZ Top and having the last name Beard. Then imagine being the only member who doesn't have the famous beard. It was almost too perfect. But that irony never defined his musicianship. In fact, it probably helped people remember him. Frank Beard became a visual contradiction. His name said one thing. His face said another. And the band turned that contradiction into part of its personality. But as the years passed, age began to change things. Rock musicians who started their careers in the 1960s and 1970s eventually had to deal with the physical cost of decades on the road. Frank was no exception. He experienced health problems over the years. In 2025, he temporarily stepped away from touring because of an undisclosed health issue. He later returned. That return mattered because it showed how much he still wanted to play. He wasn't simply sitting at home watching his career from a distance. He was still part of ZZ Top. Then came 2026. The band was still touring. The schedule was still demanding. But Frank's health had become a more serious concern. He took another leave from the road. And this time, the situation did not improve. On August 17, 2026, Frank Beard died at his ranch in Richmond, Texas. He was 77. He was receiving hospice care and was surrounded by family. The exact cause of death has not been publicly disclosed. That detail is important. Because when a famous person dies, the internet immediately starts producing theories. People search for a cause. They repeat rumors. They connect old health problems to a new death. But unless the family or an authoritative source confirms the cause, we simply do not know. What we do know is that Frank had been dealing with health issues and had recently stepped away from touring. What we do know is that his final days were spent in hospice care. And what we know for certain is that one of rock music's most recognizable drummers is gone. His death also means something bigger for ZZ Top. Dusty Hill was already gone. Now Frank Beard is gone too. Billy Gibbons is the only surviving member of the classic trio. That makes this moment especially emotional. The three men who created that unmistakable ZZ Top sound can no longer stand together on a stage. But the music remains. The records remain. The videos remain. The jokes remain. And every time that familiar drum groove begins, Frank's presence returns. That may be the strange thing about music. A musician can disappear from the world. But if they left something powerful behind, they never completely disappear. Frank Beard left thousands of performances, decades of recordings, and a rhythm that became part of American rock history. He didn't need to be the loudest member of ZZ Top. He didn't need to grow the longest beard. He didn't need to become a larger-than-life celebrity. He simply needed to sit behind the drums and play. And for more than 50 years, that's exactly what he did. Frank Beard, a final tribute. There is something almost poetic about Frank Beard's story. He spent his entire career sitting behind three musicians who became larger than life. Billy Gibbons became known for his guitar, his voice, and his enormous beard. Dusty Hill became known for his bass, his voice, and his enormous beard. And Frank Beard became known as the man whose last name was Beard but who didn't have one. It sounds like a joke. And it was. But Frank was much more than the punchline. He was the drummer who helped hold ZZ Top together. He was there when the band was still playing small Texas stages. He was there when they became one of the biggest rock bands in America. He was there when MTV turned them into visual icons. He was there when the band entered the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. He was there when the world lost Dusty Hill. And even when his own health began making touring more difficult, he kept trying to come back. That tells you something about Frank Beard. He loved playing. He loved the band. And he understood what ZZ Top meant to people. For fans who discovered the group in the 1980s, Frank may be remembered as the drummer from those unforgettable videos. For older fans, he may be remembered from the Texas blues and boogie days. For musicians, he may be remembered for his groove. For the people who knew him personally, he was something much simpler. A friend. A husband. A father. A Texan. And a musician. Those are the things that often disappear when a celebrity dies. The headlines focus on the famous moments. The photographs focus on the stage. The videos focus on the image. But behind all of it was a real person. Frank Beard was married to Debbie Meredith, and they had 3 children. He built a life away from the stage while still maintaining one of the longest careers in rock music. He also became known for his interest in golf and life in Texas. That contrast is interesting. On stage, ZZ Top looked almost mythical. Off stage, Frank could simply be Frank. And maybe that is why his story feels different. He never seemed to need the spotlight as much as some rock stars did. His contribution was always there, but often hidden inside the music. That is what makes his death so significant. When a singer dies, people immediately remember the voice. When a guitarist dies, people remember the solos. But when a great drummer dies, you sometimes realize how much of the music was being held together by someone you were not consciously watching. Frank Beard was one of those musicians. You may not have been staring at him during a ZZ Top performance. But you were feeling him. Every beat. Every pause. Every groove. Every transition. He was the pulse underneath the band's personality. And now that pulse has stopped. On August 17, 2026, Frank Beard passed away at the age of 77. The cause of death remains undisclosed. His final period was marked by health problems and time away from touring. But it would be a mistake to let the final chapter become the entire story. Frank Beard's story is not only about illness. It is not only about addiction. It is not only about death. It is about survival. It is about music. It is about friendship. And it is about staying with something long enough to become part of history. More than 5 decades after ZZ Top came together, the band's music is still instantly recognizable. That is an extraordinary achievement. Thousands of bands have formed. Thousands have recorded albums. Thousands have played arenas. But very few have created a sound that can be identified after only a few seconds. ZZ Top did. And Frank Beard helped create that sound. So when you hear La Grange, remember the drummer. When you hear Tush, remember the drummer. When Sharp-Dressed Man comes on, remember the drummer. When Legs takes you back to the MTV era, remember the drummer. Because behind all those famous images was a musician doing something incredibly difficult. Making it sound effortless. That was Frank Beard's gift. He wasn't just the guy behind the famous beards. He wasn't just the drummer whose name created a funny contradiction. He was one of the essential pieces of ZZ Top. And perhaps the best way to understand his legacy is this. ZZ Top had a look that everyone remembered. But it had a heartbeat that kept everything moving. That heartbeat belonged to Frank Beard. His life had difficult chapters. His career had unexpected turns. He faced addiction and recovered. He faced health problems. He lost his longtime bandmate Dusty Hill. And finally, he stepped away from the stage for the last time. But he left behind something that no headline can take away. The music. The rhythm. The memories. The decades of performances. And a place in rock history that was earned one beat at a time. Frank Beard may have been the least visibly bearded member of ZZ Top. But he was always a beard. And now, he is part of rock history forever. If you grew up listening to ZZ Top, this is one of those moments when the music suddenly feels different. Because the next time those drums begin, you will know exactly who is behind them. Frank Beard. A Texas drummer. A survivor. A legend. And the heartbeat of ZZ Top. If you enjoyed this tribute and want more stories about the real lives, careers, struggles, and legacies of legendary musicians, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay with us for the next story. Because sometimes, the person standing behind the spotlight is the one whose story deserves to be remembered the most.